This is the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture's annual public lecture featuring Vijay Prashad, an alumnus of the university, in conversation with my friend and colleague, Professor Adom Getachew. I'm Michael Dawson, a professor in the Department of Political Science and the current and founding director of the CSRPC. This is my last year as director, and it is my sincere pleasure to end the year with one of our most important signature programs, our annual public lecture, which features distinguished public intellectuals whose work promotes engaged thought and scholarship around the topics of race and ethnicity within the public sphere. Last year, as we celebrated the Center's 20th anniversary, we hosted Kathleen Neal Cleaver in this very space. The year before that, we hosted Dr. Cornel West in the middle of a blizzard. It is Chicago, on Super Bowl Sunday. We also had the honor of hosting Danny Glover and Dr. Angela Davis. We cannot continue to create space for these types of engaged scholars without the support of our many partners. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our hosts this evening, the International House, the Global Voices Program, and incredible stewards, Denise Jorgens and Mary Beth DeStefano. I'd also like to thank the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics and Center for Asian Health Equity for their continued partnership. We are greatly appreciative of our ongoing partnership with Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Please say hello to Jeff Deutsch and the team when you stop by the table at the rear to purchase a book or two, and I would say 3 or 4 if you can. There will be a brief signing after tonight's conversation. I'd like to extend a very special thanks to our students for insisting that we invite Prashad back to campus. And Prashad for coming back. That's people don't always come back here. And particularly these students currently involved with the PanAsia Solidarity Coalition and Students for Justice in Palestine. These events would simply not happen without the incredible work of our staff and volunteers. I'd like to thank the staff of the CSRPC, our Associate Director, Tracy Matthews, Student Affairs Administrator, Sari Tue, Program Coordinator, Dara Epsion, Graduate Student Media Assistant, Julius Jones, and our Workshop Coordinator, Alfredo Gonzalez. Many thanks to our volunteers and others involved with making this event run smoothly. If you have any questions or need assistance during the program, please find one of the members of our team. I've also been told to encourage everyone, you can tell my age, to live tweet the event using the hashtag UChicago v. Prashad. That's UCHIVPRAASHAD, unquote. At this time, I'd like to introduce Omi Su. This program in some way started with Omi, who taught Prashad's work in an undergraduate course entitled, quote, Asian American Studies, not quite introductory, unquote, through the CSRPC in the autumn quarter. It was one of our most successful classes. The class looked at Prashad's seminal work, Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, Afro-Asian Connections in the Midst of Cultural Purity, also available for purchase this evening. As a PhD student in the Department of Political Science, Omi's work is focused on the conceptual conditions of being political, on how articulations of some of the self-evident categories of political life and political theory, life and death, public-private, track adjustments to, and strategies of power, while they may also be the scene and objects of political activity. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Omi to the stage.
Thank you. All right, thank you. So Michael Dawson neither needs nor had someone to introduce him, but if someone did, they would probably tell you that he has recently been selected as the very first recipient of the Haynes Walton Jr. Award for Career Achievement in Race, Ethnicity, and Politics from the American Political Science Association. Oh, and the selection committee wrote, I quote, "It is virtually impossible to do work in the field of race, ethnicity, and politics without encountering his scholarly legacy, exclamation point." Which is true. So the point is that I am flanked by excellent teachers. They have challenged scholars to think more dynamically about the circulation and coalescence of power, And they have invited students of political action to distribute and take up the responsibilities of agency in the project of generating solidarity laterally. I had, for instance, as Michael noted, the opportunity to teach some of Vijay Prashad's work in the class in the fall. For my students, encountering his thought was enabling, but it was also incredibly demanding. Oh, hi, so many of you are here. So one of them wrote a response to his book, Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, available for purchase in the back. The student wrote, Prashad suggests making distinctions between various struggles against oppression while building an equivalence between them in a piecemeal coalition without submerging political identity. Members of society cannot claim that the past actions of their society are not their responsibility. The case for acknowledging complicity remains significant insofar as it is conducive to a politically generative effect. The point is not who's more down. The focus has to be on a principled solidarity in individual and collective struggles. The particular universalism invoked by Prashad offers one such outlook with a commitment to internationalism rooted in socialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist principles that help inform a configuration of power alternative to white supremacist formations. I share this experience with you in order to highlight the density and the vitality and the difficulty and impact that categorical introductory remarks so often fail to capture. That said, I'm going to do those now anyways. Vijay Prashad is Professor of International Studies and the George and Martha Kellner Chair of South Asia History at Trinity College. Prashad was the director of Trinity's International Studies program for over a decade and was the founding co-director of the Trinity Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies. In 2013, he was Edward Said Chair at the American University of Beirut, where he remains a senior research fellow. He's the author of 15 books, some of which are available for purchase. 2 of them picked up by the Village Voice as Books of the Year, and the editor of 10 edited volumes. As a journalist, he writes regularly for The Hindu and Frontline of India, BirGün of Turkey, and Alternet here in the States, and appears regularly on the Real News Network and Democracy Now! He is the chief editor of LeftWord Books of New Delhi, and he has appeared in 2 films, Shadow World and 2 Meetings. Oh, and just for funsies, he's an alum of the university. He got his PhD in history here in 1994, so there's hope for us yet. In conversation with Prashad will be Adom Getachew, a Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science in the college here at the University of Chicago. She holds a joint PhD in Political Science and African American Studies from Yale University. Her research interests are situated in the history of political thought, with specialized interests in international law, theories of empire and race, Black political thought, and post-colonial political theory. Adom's current project, titled World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, excavates and reconstructs, oh, by the way, this is her eloquence and not mine, excavates and reconstructs an account of self-determination offered in the political thought of Nnamdi Azikiwe, W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Eric Williams, Julius Nyerere, and Michael Manley during the height of decolonization in the 20th century. Drawing on archival research in Barbados, Ghana, Switzerland, Trinidad, and the United Kingdom, the project illustrates how these anti-colonial critics, intellectuals, and statesmen reinvented the concept of self-determination as a project of world-making, in which they reconceived international political and economic relations. So please join me in welcoming Vijay Prashad and Adom Getachew.
Okay, let me just drop this here. Hello. Good evening. Thank you, Michael, Tracy, and Naomi. Thanks a lot. Thanks for bringing me back to the International House, I-House. A very close friend of mine lived here for the 2 years that I was in Chicago, Aditya Behel, who very sadly died a few years ago. But Addie had a room on the other corridor. and was always surrounded in his room with his manuscripts of medieval Indian poetry. And that's how I'd like to remember him, in this building, surrounded by his manuscripts, coughing, because he always coughed. He was an asthmatic from childhood, and it afflicted him greatly. But this university welcomed him because he was just such a nerd. I mean, he so much belonged here. And I was very sad to hear when he died. I had a strange relationship with the university, but this is not about me, so I'm not going to get into that. I will say, though, that today Roger Ailes died. And, it's one of those things where I'd like to take a moment of silence for all his victims. And I'd like to add myself to the list. For about 2 months, his protege, Bill O'Reilly, made my life hell. So when I heard of his death today, at least I can say to Bill O'Reilly, who was sacked, and Roger Ailes, who died today, I can at least say to them that, people like me might say crazy things and might believe crazy things, but we don't disrespect people. We don't harass women. We don't go out there and yell at people in public. We are decent people with crazy ideas. And, if I had to choose between decency and crazy ideas, I'd pick both of them any day, any day, over being obnoxious in all respects, including as a human being. So this was an obnoxious human being, and it's startling how the American media rehabilitates people immediately. They immediately say, well, he was good. This is, today on MSNBC, Chris Matthews said, he was bad if you're a woman, but he had all these great... this is a guy who faked town hall meetings for Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. I mean, this is a guy who invented the alternative news industry. It's amazing how quickly the establishment gathers around its own and says, well, on balance, they had this bad, dark side, but on balance, they were good. That's not the world I want to live in. The world I want to live in, if somebody behaves badly, then you don't need to respect them. Okay. On that note, so, when Noam Chomsky used to be asked, what would you like to speak about? And he was invited, 8 months hence, he used to always give the same topic. And the topic was the current crisis in the Middle East. 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, that it's going to be a relevant topic. I was thinking about that a great deal in the last few months, because, if somebody invites me, will you come and speak? I could give the same topic, the crisis in the White House. It's any day there's going to be some drama. It actually is not even day, it's by minutes. I don't know what happened in the last 10 minutes. Something consequential likely happened. The president may have sent another tweet with about 6 misspellings in it, which bothers the media more than the content of the tweet. That he couldn't spell, what was it, council today? He spelled it with an E instead of an I or something. That excises people. The president can't spell. What about what he's saying? American establishment culture would like us now to believe that Trump's departure, which may be imminent, is going to save the United States and the Republic and, these other great things that need saving. But I would like to submit, imagine when you're in your home and your light bulb begins to flicker. Your fear immediately is, it's not just the light bulb, it's the wiring. And you want desperately to believe it's the light bulb. You want desperately to believe that the filament will burn out. And then you can gingerly remove that light bulb and put another one on and it doesn't flicker. And you think, saved. Millions of dollars or whatever it takes to get new wiring, saved. Don't have to call the electrician and feel humiliated again. Electrician said, well, it's tube and bulb and, things that you don't understand. And you stand there thinking, every time the electrician says something I don't understand, it's going to cost more. This is how people feel when they take a car into the garage. You're never sure. You took the car in. The more they speak, the bill is going to increase. So liberals right now believe that the light bulb is defective. That is Trump. The filament is flickering. What they don't want to imagine is that the wiring is short. That Trump might go tomorrow. Pence might appear. And in fact, it's not even Pence. I mean, Pence is, as Jeremy Scahill so correctly put it, a combination of Dick Cheney and Jerry Falwell. You know, you might suddenly think we'll be saved by Pence. I mean, Americans have gone crazy. We'll be saved by Pence, a combination of Dick Cheney and Jerry Falwell. But it's not about Pence either. I'm going to come back to what I think it's about. Or Americans will say, Bannon is horrible. Oh my God, I listened to that speech. It's horrible, scares me. It's a dark side. I don't know what he's saying. They say the mature people in the White House will protect America. Then you want to remind them that they're talking about H.R. McMaster, who in his book on Vietnam said that if only we were allowed to bomb without restraint, the Vietnamese would have been on their knees. You know, McMaster somehow becomes the grown-up in the White House. And you think, have you lost your mind? It's like people who believed during the election campaign that Ted Cruz was a moderate conservative. I mean, this is a guy who wanted to basically nuclear bomb Syria. He said, I want to make the desert glow. How is this guy acceptable? So this belief that the bulb is flickering, and if you just remove the bulb and put a new one in, everything will be okay. This is how I understand the exercise of watching, say, MSNBC, or reading the New York Times or the Washington Post. They are imagining that the bulb is defective and that a new bulb is going to solve everything. In fact, what I'm going to suggest in the next 12, 13 minutes is that this is not a problem of the bulb. This is the problem of the system. It is gravely, gravely in crisis. Now, you, like I, have met at the street corner very well-meaning religious people on one side of the street, left-wing radicals on the other side, each of them selling you a newspaper, each of them telling you the world is coming to an end. One because of God's dispensation, the other because capitalism is going to collapse. And you run away from both. You triangulate down the middle, saying, I can't hear you, and you run down the street. Now, I'm generally not the kind of person that walks around saying the world is coming to an end. The end is nigh. You know, gird yourselves. Put on your Mormon underwear. He's bringing you up any minute. You know, you don't want to be naked to him when you go up there. On the other hand, this does seem a little odd and scary. And it also seems odd and scary because, to my mind, there is a crisis that's much deeper than the politics. And that's what I want to just talk about for a little bit. You know, there is so much that what Bannon says that's correct. And that's what I think is interesting. When Trump gave his inaugural address, he used a phrase, American carnage. And, you know, a lot of people criticized him, said that his inaugural address was too bleak. You know, how could an American believe that? America is a country of optimism. You're meant to always say, the city on the hill, the beacon will shine brighter than before. You can't be pessimistic about the American project. One must be optimistic. And yet here was Trump in a speech most likely written by Bannon talking about American carnage. You know, it's like the name of a horror film. How could that have been the principal theme of his inaugural address, American carnage? Now, the problem with that phrase is adding American to the carnage, because the carnage really is global. And this is the carnage, in a sense, to be rather straightforward, of capitalism. Because, you know, I don't have very much time to get into this, but two of the net effects of capitalism, two of the outcomes of capitalism, are essentially what we have seen for the last 150 to 200 years. One is increasing immiseration of the bulk of the population of the world. You know, people are not looking like they're having very happy dreams at night because they're not having an easy time sleeping at night. Why? Because their work day is stretched into the night. Because their lives have basically been overtaken by work, either looking for work desperately or working two jobs or traveling very far for work. Most people's work lives have eclipsed the rest of their life. The increasing immiseration, if not in monetary terms, in human terms, is one of the outcomes of capitalism. This was, I think, brought out in a book of immense obviousness by Thomas Piketty, where Piketty basically proved the obvious, which is that there's inequality in the world. I mean, Thomas, let me take you for a drive through Bombay, for instance. Let's go for a drive in Bombay. Let's just have a look in Chicago. Let's drive around Chicago and feel the edge of inequality. Really, was there a need for the world intellectual population to be so surprised by Piketty's book, to celebrate it so greatly? Such an obvious singular point. Anyway, one of the outcomes of capitalism is immiseration, inequality, etc., where systemic risk is basically borne by ordinary people. The rich never bear. And we know all this intuitively. Banks collapse, money goes to save the bankers. None goes to save people who are being evicted. Systemic risk always borne by ordinary people, never borne by the system or by the elites. Second outcome of capitalism is sustained, rigorous substitution of human workers by machines. Now, you might say, I don't know what you're talking about, but let me ask you a question. The last time you went to the airport, who checked you in? It was either your computer at home or it was that kiosk at the airport. Nobody stands in the queue and talks to somebody and says, here's my thing. That worker back there, it's very easy to say, United, horrible company. Why do these people on the plane behave so badly? These people on the plane don't start getting paid until the handbrake on the plane goes down and the plane starts to reverse. Our outrage on social media, those are the most overworked workers. You can't imagine, they're probably in delirium on the plane when they're seating people. And people are often extraordinarily rude to them. This is a systemic problem, not that there's one rude worker here or one rude American Airlines person. That's how we get worked up about it. I can't believe, who is that person? Let's shame them. We don't want to shame the system, but machines substituting for labor, putting immense pressure on the few people that remain working. So the airline is a great example, but banks are another example. You have ATM machines with which you interact, and then there's just a few people doing extraordinarily complicated jobs with numbers of people wanting to see them. I mean the people who deal with wires and things like that. So you narrow the number of people, you let machines substitute, and then put much more pressure on the ones that remain. Those of you who are teachers know exactly what I'm talking about. The more machines come in, the more, in fact, on you, so that you're then sitting at 9 o'clock at night and you get a message from your supervisor saying, don't forget the meeting tomorrow at 8. It's 9 o'clock at night. I should be watching some crap on TV. I shouldn't have to be reading an email from my supervisor, because if I don't respond to it, at 9:30 the supervisor writes again and say, didn't you see my email? It's 9 o'clock at night. This is my time. You don't have any time. This is the city of the 8-hour day. You know exactly that 8 hours is a joke. So machines substitute for labor, but put more pressure on the labor that remains employed. So they don't liberate you. Machines actually oppress you more. In Northern Africa, from one end to the other, there are trade unions of workers who are college graduates who are unemployed. So they are unions of college graduates who are unemployed. This is a phenomena that we are seeing across the world, where those who don't have a college degree might end up finding some kind of work. Those in college, some of them get very high-paying jobs, but a very large number of them cannot meet the expectations. So they basically become part of the systematically unemployed. Hundreds of millions of people around the planet Earth essentially no longer needed for capital accumulation. They have become basically the surplus population of capitalism. They are not needed anymore. Chicago has its surplus in very large numbers as well. This is what capitalism does. Now add to that the next keyword. I'm going to give you 5 keywords. First is capitalism. Second keyword is globalization. When globalization arrived in the 1980s, it arrived in a very specific way, that capital was allowed to break borders, finance and commercial and industrial capital, but labor had to be trapped in borders. So you had free movement of capital, but labor was not free. So only one part of the economic bargain was freed. The other part remained to be held in national containers. the other aspect about globalization was the northern countries wrote the rules for globalization to benefit northern capital much more than southern capital, which was anyway much weaker than northern capital. Now, what this meant was that by 1992, when the Chinese basically allowed their workers access to big capital could come into China and utilize this enormous workforce. By the time the Chinese delivered their workers to global capital in 1992, almost every country in the world had delivered its labor by 1992 to world capital. The Third World Project had basically collapsed, so workers from previously autarkic economies in the Third World were delivered to multinational capital. Soviet Union collapsed, Eastern Europe collapsed by 1991. They delivered all those workers to global capital, and then by 92, the Chinese came and finished the deal. By 1992, because workers were still trapped inside the national container and capital could move, and because northern capital was much more advantaged because it helped write the rules of the new dispensation, northern capital could take advantage of what is known as labor arbitrage. It could decide, thanks to new technologies, communications and transportation networks, etc., to basically break up factories and place bits and pieces of them anywhere in the planet it chose. This is what we call the disarticulation of production. Anywhere in the planet you could put little pieces. Now, because you're putting little pieces of what used to be gigantic factories, and because you are not investing in the factory. In other words, the capital itself doesn't invest in a factory. Nike doesn't make any shoes. You allow subcontractors to invest in those countries and hire labor, which is now competing globally, and that subcontractor will produce a piece of the product. So disarticulation of production is also the disarticulation of risk. Now, the risk in capitalism is no more held by capital. It is held by the petty producer at the other side of the planet often. So what you start to see is you start to see a kind of topography of capitalism where at the very low levels, there's dog-eat-dog competitive capitalism. So between, say, a factory in Haiti and a factory in the Dominican Republic, both on the same island, both producing textiles, there's fierce competition between these two small factories which are maybe stitching on the sweatshirt, University of Chicago. And that's what these two factories stitch, University of Chicago, and they are in dog-eat-dog competition. Meanwhile, the retail house that has the contract to the university doesn't actually compete with anybody. At the top level of capitalism, it's all monopolies. So whether it's Apple, it's Nike, it's the people who do college sweatshirts, these are all monopolies. They set prices, they engineer the way the system works. They don't compete with anybody. And they are allowed to exist because they have immense political power. So capitalism has this strange topography now of monopolies at the macro level and fierce laissez-faire dog-eat-dog competition at the micro level. That's what the system then produces. But meanwhile, in the north and in very many pockets of the south, increasing workers are being displaced by machines. You know, a study was done by Bowling Green. Conservative economists studied job loss in America, just as an example. And what they found was that only 12% of American job loss is because of trade rules. 88% is because of mechanization. The bulk of jobs lost in the United States are because of mechanization and increased productivity. Now, we know this as university professors. When I first went into this industry, our department used to have its own administrative assistant. Now, 5 departments share one administrative assistant, and everybody who's a chair has to do the kind of jobs the admin used to do before. So you've fired 4 people, essentially, by agglomerating everybody, and you allow email and computers to help the department heads do the jobs that used to be provided out to somebody else to do. Those people are unemployed, and you get these professors now having to do admin work where the stress on them is much greater. So this cleaves society greatly. You have people structurally unemployed, and you have a very small number of people with permanent jobs, also waged in one way or the other, but working 2-3 times as hard as they used to before. And not understanding when people say there are no jobs out there. There's a naivete that strikes those who have jobs and who see productivity increase, in not seeing that their productivity increase is related to the endemic joblessness of the many. This is globalization. It produces a crisis. The crisis it produces is, on the one side, as I said, increased social inequality, and on the other side, joblessness. Now, neoliberalism is not actually the author of this crisis. It's the first attempt to solve the crisis. And its solution comes on many axes. One axis is basically to cannibalize resources, to make sure you can enhance your budgets, to continue doing some kind of social spending, moderate social spending. So you cannibalize resources. You privatize education, privatize healthcare, privatize this, privatize that, commodify water, things like that. That's the well-known policy slate of neoliberalism. But there's also a cultural policy slate of neoliberalism equally important, which is the theory of the entrepreneur. It constructs this idea and tries to sell it to create hegemony in the population, that what you need to be is not a citizen, but an entrepreneur. Citizenship is not what we cultivate in the 21st century. We cultivate entrepreneurialism. So in schools, you have competitions for students. You can get $10 to start with and go and start a stock portfolio. And at the end of the term, if you can make your $10 to $20, you get an A. If you get $10 to $18, you get a B. They actually monetize grades in this fashion. But the point isn't to teach you how to work the stocks, but to create the entrepreneurial spirit. Unleash the animal spirits in people. Don't produce community, produce entrepreneurial individuals. It's not enough to say produce individualism. It's actually a specific cultural kind of individualism. Don't worry about heroes in society. Our heroes are philanthropists. They are so kind. Forget that they don't pay taxes, but they donate money to us. Let us carve their name like great Roman emperors in marble in the front of their NGO. Let's write Bill Gates, Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. We bow to you for your generosity. Not for the fact that you don't pay taxes, but because you are so kind and philanthropic. Philanthropy is the other side of entrepreneurialism. Our heroes are not sports people, but philanthropists. They must be celebrated. So this is the kind of cultural avenue pushed by the neoliberal policy slate. It's the other side of privatization. Because the idea is if you can produce enough entrepreneurs, they will produce enough value to increase the bulk of growth in the economy, and they may hire people. But we know this is not going to happen. It's an illogical theory. It was always premised on failing. Because why would you, if you were an entrepreneur, if you were at the University of Chicago and you invented a device, that you could just pop into your eye if you lost an eye and it works. If you invented some kind of artificial eye, why would you manufacture this in Chicago? You'd manufacture this in Malaysia. You'd go somewhere where the labor costs are low. You'd go somewhere where you can have people with, decent skills who are unemployed, college degrees, PhDs even in Bangalore, who will work in a factory, essentially with robots to produce the artificial eye. Because they are cheaper than hiring labor here. Why would you hire labor here? The arbitrage works against you. So the neoliberal policy was always slated to fail. Having failed, what comes next? And this is the emergence, in a sense, of cruel populism. Because cruel populism, which is my last keyword, cruel populism is interesting. It shares something with Nazism. And I can say a little about that before we start chatting. Cruel populism is the following. Unlike neoliberalism, cruel populism says, yes, it's terrible. See, neoliberalism, because its cultural content is about entrepreneurialism, generally likes to speak as if the world is sunny. Bill Clinton was the king of that. We're going to get you off welfare. You're going to become an entrepreneur. You're going to create value in your community. There'll be enterprise zones, and these enterprise zones are going to suddenly boom. You know, every street with blight is going to have Starbucks, Wi-Fi. Suddenly you're going to be as if you're in like a Volkswagen commercial, listening to some European pop music, driving around going, yeah, my life is great. You know, so that is the imagination of neoliberalism. Everything is super, consumption is going to save us. But cruel populism is much darker as ideology in its notions. It also tells the truth. It says that things are bad for you. Now, interestingly, there is an error in the analysis of how Mr. Trump won and how the right is gaining in Europe. It's not the white working class that went behind Trump. This is a very wrong analysis. It's the white-collar workers, not the big bourgeoisie, because they anyway are split cleverly between the two parties in order better to tether them. That's not the point. You don't look at the bourgeoisie to understand the way the wind blows, because they split evenly very tactically. I think it's a clever decision. Always have your hip liberals with the Democrats and your, steak-eating, Manhattan-drinking fellas with the Republicans to make sure everybody's okay. No, it's not them. You know the show on television, The Office? That's the America I'm thinking of. It's the office parks in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. I went for a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, and people there were some people in biker jackets and ready to beat the crap out of you. That's the old, classic racist crowd. They generally either don't vote or they vote Republican. That's the classic racist crowd. Those are irrelevant people, in a way, because they are marginal in terms of their ability to swing large publics behind them. These are the hardcore racists. But the people that are interesting are those people who basically look like office workers, who are basically data processors, who worked in the office, in some office park outside Columbus, Ohio, in a suburb. And on the basis of that job, they bought a suburban house, and they had this life. And then, that disappeared. Now remember, the white working class lost its jobs 25 years ago. Its crisis has been going on for a long time, and nobody gives a damn about these jobs. Gary, Indiana, just outside here, you drive past US Steel, that's been shuttered when I was in grad school. We used to go and visit there just to take pictures of it, saying, this is once what America was, and it's been closed, and you can see the cobwebs, it's never coming back. Those jobs went. These are the jobs that are outsourced to Ireland, India, Malaysia, China. These are BPO, business process outsourcing jobs. Now, it's very interesting that these are jobs that are there. And these are targeted. About 2 years ago, Donald Trump went on Steve Bannon's show on Breitbart. And on this show, Bannon asked him, what do you think of the H-1B program, which brings in highly skilled workers basically into the tech sector and into banking, etc. Bannon hates Indians, by the way, and I'll come back to this in a minute. If you think he's a racist and a hater of Muslims, he doesn't hate anybody as much as he hates Indians. It's extraordinary. You got to listen to his radio program. And, Trump at the time in his naive way said, no, I love these guys. They're smart. We should bring them in. Because after all, in the Trump Corporation, there's a ton of these H-1B type people, doing the computer work. Bannon calls him in. Ajay, come in here. Fix my computer. Some guy, Ajay, comes in, and it's working. Trump doesn't know how to work a computer. Doesn't know how to spell. So, Ajay, check my spelling. So, he asked him, and Trump says, I love these guys, they're great. And Bannon was kind of subdued in that interview. The next time Trump came on the Bannon show, Bannon asked him again, what do you think about H-1B? And Trump said, it's terrible, the program should go. It's a horrible program. And then he started to go to Ohio, Pennsylvania, all these states, and rail against H-1B. He'd say, these people come here. And Bannon said something important which Trump didn't repeat. He probably didn't understand what Bannon said. But Bannon said that they don't have Jefferson democracy in their DNA, which is a very nice way of talking about race. They don't have Jefferson democracy in their DNA. Other people have Jeffersonian democracy in their DNA. Muslim terrorists, Mexican rapists, and Indian nerds don't have Jeffersonian democracy in their DNA. This is the triumvirate of hatred of this political platform. So Trump then joins in and is vituperative. I mean, he goes at it. They knew they were appealing to basically the white collar workers from the office parks who had been displaced and had been the leaders of the Tea Party movement. This is what I don't understand in the American media. They keep talking about this white working class. See, in America, nobody talks about the phrase working class. Everybody is firstly supposed to be middle class. Until this election happened, and suddenly all the TV channels started talking about the working class. These people don't understand class at all anyway on television. So their specificity is not to be taken seriously. What they mean is, when these guys who make millions of dollars to sit in front of a TV camera and talk nonsense all day, when these guys talk about the working class, they're thinking about the person who sits in an office park at a computer. They actually may have a better intuitive understanding of class than some of the times we teach class. These are also working class people, but they are not working class in the sense that their collars are blue and their hands are greasy. They work in these office parks. So this displacement is very important, and it's about. Now I'm going to come back to, they identify correctly, the cruel populists, that there is a kind of carnage in jobs, that there's been a big job loss in these sectors. And it is because of globalization. It is because of labor arbitrage. I can't understand, again, when economists come on TV and say it has nothing to do with, how can it not have anything to do? Entire back offices moved abroad, and entire companies were created in India, like Tata Consultancy Services, to bring people in for 6-8 months to work in insurance, in medical industry, etc., to do computer work here on short-term contracts, what we call indentured coolies, high-tech indenture. This is what's happening. How can you deny labor arbitrage as a factor? So, but whereas the cruel populists agree with reality on this one point, they don't allow the implications of the agreement to go all the way. And we can talk about this in a minute. What they do instead is they take the first exit they see, which is racism. And that's why I associate this thought with Nazism. They see the problem that capitalism has produced joblessness. But rather than indict the system and try to think of new ways to live in a society not of work but of leisure with machines, they take the first exit they find as a consequence of the furrows created in American history, and they blame Mexicans, Muslims, H-1B workers, etc. That's the first exit that they take. In the same way as the National Socialists or the Nazis correctly identified the crisis in capitalism in the 1920s and 30s. They talked openly about capitalist instability, joblessness, etc. But then they also took the first available exit. Instead of indicting this abstract system of social domination, they blame Jews. They blame Jews as the stand-in for international finance. It's the same kind of thinking. This is why I think of these guys as Nazis more than fascists. Fascism requires a different set of conditions. The United States is not in a situation of impending fascism. But these guys ideologically are basically Nazis. So to end very briefly, then, because we're going to talk some more, Trump can come and go. He is an irrelevancy to my thinking. He is a sideshow. He will embarrass himself. He'll embarrass the elite. At some point, they might make an arrangement. He decides to not speak so much, or he is indeed impeached, or something happens to him. But this problem will remain. Neither neoliberalism nor cruel populism will answer the actual problems faced by people, which is joblessness. And sadly, in the West in particular, where this crisis has been percolating for decades, the left has not articulated a believable answer. What is the left vision to endemic joblessness? You see, the left believes, in a way, at least the kind of what passes for a left in the United States believes, the answer is to get jobs for people. And I really hope we'll talk about this more, but I'm not going to say, I'm going to end with this line. My hope is to live in a world where we only work maybe 1 or 2 hours a day. And we spend the rest of our time meeting, chatting, doing political work, building strong communities, building neighborhood organizations, loving people around us, and not dying, essentially, letting our minds die at work. Imagine that world for a minute. This is still May. Yesterday I went to the Haymarket area where there's no memorial anymore. There's now luxury condos being built. But they asked for an 8-hour day, where they said 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what you will. Today we don't understand the concept what you will. It's my feeling that the left globally has to seize on that phrase, and what you will. Because, you know, the goal in life is to be people, not to be workers or to be rich. I'll submit to you, the goal in life is not to be an entrepreneur. It's to be a human being. And why can't we talk openly about being human beings? Thanks a lot. Is that time okay? Okay. Which side do you want to say?
Okay, so we have a lot of material to discuss. Thank you very much for that talk. So I guess I wanted to start thinking or talking a bit more about this question of joblessness. And one thing that struck me about the election was the economic platforms that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump offered, and in particular, the ways they staged those programs. So if you remember, Hillary Clinton gave her big economic speech in front of a factory in Detroit. And Donald Trump gave his speech in front of, went to Pittsburgh, basically, talked about steel workers. So I wondered, I mean, I think your story about kind of the white collar working class being really central and being an ignored part of the story about Trump is right. So even in the early primaries, there were all these statistics about what the average income of a Trump supporter were, and they're not making poverty wages, they're not part of the working class, but you know, average incomes of $77,000, basically. So I think that is an ignored part of the story, but I wonder, I mean, what do you think is the continued fascination with the factory and the factory worker, both for the Democrats, for the Republicans, but I think for still some parts of the left too?
It's a great question. I think, American culture and work is a curious feature. There is a kind of masculinism about work. That what is work? Work is a miner. You go in a mine, that's work. A nurse working in a hospital is not quite the same as a miner. Or you're in a big factory, you're beating metal, building a car. I mean, the irony is those are the jobs that went 25, 30 years ago. It's not like the mines were all closed under Obama. They've been closing, for decades. In fact, that's why even under Obama, they began to loosen regulations, and we saw those 2 mine disasters. Those were not under George W. Bush. They were in the Obama period. Some miners were trapped. Many of them died. So this idea that the way work is understood. And the other thing is, for me personally, the first time I came to America, one of the things I really appreciated about the United States is there is a certain egalitarianism with labor. I come from a society where even the middle class, with the light bulb, I'm on light bulbs a lot today, light bulb goes out, they'll call somebody fix the light bulb. Some paid person will come with a ladder. It's not a difficult thing to fix. But there's a sense that I don't have to do it. I hire people to do it. So one of the, I think, very positive things about the American experience is that there is I'm not going to call it the dignity of labor because that's a wrong phrase, but there's a kind of egalitarianism. Everybody seems to have a toolkit. I always tell my immigrant friends, when you move to America, you have to go to a hardware store and buy a kit. Because, you can't just call people and say, my faucet is no. You have to learn how to work a wrench. I mean, you have to learn how to change your faucet. You'll have to learn how to fix a pot. It's too expensive to call a plumber. Learn a few basic skills. So there is this thing in the imaginary that everybody believes that, I'm in a suit working in a bank, basically demolishing factories. But I have this idea that work is the factory. And, there is, and you can see this in the American version of the show The Office, there is a certain embarrassment about office work, menial office work. Like, that show is so interesting because they never actually do any work. And it's an extraordinarily popular show. They're just sort of hanging around. It's all about office gossip. My sister used to work for a call center from her home. And it was extraordinarily tense because there was none of the chit-chat. So now, imagine those office parks closed down. If they don't outsource you abroad, they insource you into your bedroom, where you're basically starting your shift at 5 in the morning at a desk that you have to buy, at 2 computers that they provide you. And when you need to take a pee during your shift, you have to write to a supervisor and say, can I get 5 minutes personal time? And then the clock stops and you go to the bathroom. So what I'm saying is that this imaginary of work, nobody wants to admit what work actually looks like is not glamorous in the way the films, make that kind of macho work glamorous. So you don't actually see those people as real in the office park.
I mean, the masculinization of work, I think, is really interesting. And one thing in the contemporary moment in the United States is that there are actually 80,000 steel workers, right? But 800,000 nursing assistants, right? And so part of what we're seeing and part of, I think, what people can't accept is the feminization of work. So I wonder then and it seems to me the kind of work, feminized work, work of reproduction, the labor of reproduction, that's not a kind of work that disappears in the way that the factory can disappear. So as we talk about kind of a post-labor economy or a post-work economy, how do you think about questions of reproduction, questions of care work that are constitutive of being human in some ways?
Because of the way in which capitalism functions and sort of captures more and more of work and commodifies it, it was interesting that it was Marxist feminist economists in the 1970s that put the slogan out there, wages for housework. In other words, let's at least make a so-called market or see what we can value housework at in order to understand its contribution to GDP, etc. I think that was an interesting political maneuver. I mean, it's not like they expected wages actually to be paid, but it was an interesting political maneuver to talk about how GDP is itself a highly masculinized concept. It externalizes so much reproductive labor, which actually generates value. So that, there was a study done by a Wellesley College professor published in the American Economic Review in the current issue, in which she shows that the reason there's a gender pay gap is not only because women as such get paid less, but because to amplify that, the expectations are that women will not take the so-called demanding jobs because they have to have care in the house to settle. So for instance, even children or elderly parents. And these kind of expectations, gendered expectations, then mean that they don't vie for the job. That's the 15-hour job in a financial house or whatever. They'll say, look, I'm quite happy with working a 8-hour, 9-hour job. I don't want a 15-hour job because I have to go home. I want to read to my kids, whatever. So she shows that in the data that when college women and college men first get jobs, they get jobs at a similar salary level. But then after the first 10 years, the gap opens up. And that's the years, some of this is obvious, of children, but then also elderly parents, the raising. There was a great book by Nancy Folber, UMass economist, called The Invisible Heart, in which she argued that, it's the fantasy economy that works on the invisible hand. The real economy works on the invisible heart. So I often ask students, I'll put a demand curve and supply curve on the blackboard, and I'll say that's the optimal price where they meet. But of course, this assumes that you are bidding for your best deal, you know. And so then I ask them, when you negotiate with your parents, for instance, do your parents bid for the best deal? In fact, parents don't know how to bid with their children. You know, the demand curve for the parents is useless because they'll say, okay, you know, I want to give you everything. You know, some parents are crazy and say, you know, you have to work for my affection. Okay, they are crazy. But most parents do everything for their children. You know, they're not out there bidding with their kids. So is not the life of the family such a large part of people's lives? So how come the utility curve cannot explain this? That means it's not a universal theory of life. So instead of the invisible hand being generalized as a theory of life, rather than thinking that selfishness is the prime motive by which we organize society, why not understand society organized by a million motives, including by the invisible heart? And if we do that, we'd have a completely different understanding of society. I mean, I don't like this show, the Freakonomics. The reason I don't like it is they use the utility thinking to understand odd phenomena in the world. I would be much more interested in using a multiplicity of thinking to understand the multiplicity of the world. A theory cannot explain everything. There's no general theory of everything. You know, nobody has attained the status of God. So economics should not be allowed to explain everything. It should be told, you explain maybe how pricing functions in this part of the market. But even in a market, you can't understand everything.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we had Manu Goswami here a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things she was saying about is how economics is the most imperial social science in some ways, and it tries to explain everything. It has a science for everything, and I think. And in the past couple of years, we've seen a sort of growing interest in the humanities and in the humanistic social sciences more broadly on recovering and rethinking political economy as opposed to economics as a field. And the ways in which thinking political economy rather than economics offers a kind of larger story about how we got where we got, and one that isn't reductive and invested in instrumentality and calculability in the ways economics is. But so going back to some of the political questions that joblessness raises, I guess my question about feminized labor was to ask in part about whether what we're facing is really the end of jobs per se, or the beginning of a new economy, the beginning of a new kind of job, the nursing assistant, the home health aide, that being the face of the working class instead of kind of the jobless man, basically. And what kinds of political responses we might have if we center and figure that person as the working class. So one thing that's reemerged in the public debate recently is the question of universal basic income from a variety of places, and I wonder if that's one part of the answer to figuring that person, the nursing assistant or home health aide, as the figure of labor, or if you have other thoughts about what kinds of political responses or what kinds of political agency might emerge from that figure.
Let's come to your universal income, and then I'll come back to the figure. I mean, it's an idea that was first proposed in the United States by Richard Nixon, that there will be a national income, guaranteed national income. There's a problem with that framework. Two problems maybe. One is, where will you get the money from? And I'm going to come back to this in a second. Where will you get the money from? You're going to deficit finance to provide a universal income. The second problem is it's again individualistic, that everybody gets this income. I'll propose a different model. Okay. The first problem, I wouldn't start for a left horizon with the idea of the universal national income. I'd start a left horizon on the idea again that the rich have been on strike. Since the 1970s, or in some countries 1980s, the rich essentially have been on strike, but we don't know this about them. They as a class have basically stopped paying taxes. They are in a general strike against the budget, against the treasury. We think of it in terms of offshore havens or good tax accountants or loopholes, things like that, but we don't call it for what it is, which is that as a class, the rich have essentially decided to suffocate the state in terms of its social spending. They're quite happy with military spending, police spending, etc., but they have basically gone on strike. So once the rich went on strike, and once these orthodox economics ideas such as balanced budget amendments came to play, in a climate where it's impossible to cut back on policing and the military, that means that all social goods disappear. That's been the necessary effect. It's a very simple calculation. So the first thing to consider, this question of how will you pay for that, it's whenever somebody on the left says, let's do this, they'll say, how will you pay for it? They'll say, you are utopian. By the way, the greatest utopian thinking today is entrepreneurialism. What I'm saying is not utopian at all. It's realistic compared to entrepreneurialism. That's the real idealism. I hate being called, somebody say, you are just an idealist, or naive. That's the other great thing. You are naive. Okay, I have strong beliefs about how I think the world should be created, but I don't think I'm naive. That's different. So one is the rich are on strike, and we need to break that strike. So this is about politics, this first part. We should refuse the idea when somebody asks a question and get on the back foot, how will you pay for it? That should not be the statement that gets you on the back foot, where you say, well, if we could pay for it. No, we got to come right at it and say we have to break the strike. We have to be strike breakers against the rich. That's the first part. How will you pay for it? Linked to that, the second part, coming directly to national income and the individualism, there's a great category in economics called the social wage, where the idea is you don't receive the totality of your wages individually, in your individual wage packet. Some of your wages is socialized. It goes into a social wage. And in a sense, taxation in general is the instrument for creating the social wage. And then we get these wages back socially. So you may think, how do you get wages back socially? Well, what if in this fine and rich city, you had free public transport, which was actually good? You had trains that actually connected most of the city, which, it does a pretty good job, but it doesn't go everywhere. It's a very highly racialized, as you know, train network. So imagine that I got my wage back partly in free public transport. I don't have to buy a ticket. I can just get on the train, get off the train. Why not? What if I got my wages back in free education to all institutions? You apply for sure. If you don't get in, you don't get in. But if you get in, it's free. Free healthcare. You walk into a hospital, they keep cutting mental health clinics in Chicago. There's some problem in the city that every time they see a mental health clinic, they say, let's cut it. Better to cut it and save money than to take care of people. What if we had health clinics in every 5 streets, there's a clinic. I hate making an appointment with my doctor. I always feel meek. I go in and I have a stupid question. I have this strange growth. Can you look at it? I've made an appointment 4 or 5 weeks. I've forgotten the urgency of some growth that I wanted to show. I go in 5 weeks later and I'm like, now I'm embarrassed to see you. I can't see the growth. But I took a picture of it. Would you like to see it? The picture of my thing. I should be able to walk into a health clinic and show them my, whatever obsession I have. My knee is hurting a little. We are all hypochondriac a little. I've got some pain. Better to show it immediately. So have a clinic everywhere. These are social wages. So I would say, rather than a guaranteed national income, increase the social wages. And in that, I'll give a caveat. One day I was driving to work. I live in Northampton, very nice liberal town. I was driving out to Hartford, the poorest city, second poorest city in America. You may not know this, but it's after, I think, one of the cities in Alabama, it's Hartford. And anyway, I was getting out and I was going to, if all of you know, those mind-numbing meetings for 3 hours which you know it's going to be mind-numbing, but you haven't arrived at it yet, and you're already in a horrible frame of mind because you anticipate the last hour. You know what that last hour feels like. I'm sitting at the intersection, 6:30 in the morning, meeting starts at 9. There was a clown at the intersection with a sign that said, "I am an asshole." He was a full clown with the clown shoes, "I am an asshole." I was looking at him, he wasn't doing, just standing there. He wasn't asking for money, he was just there. I looked at him, I thought, what is this? It's 6:30 in the morning. Who the hell gets into a full clown thing and stands there, "I am an asshole"? So all of us salaried workers, you see, getting to the freeway, all of us accelerate and go off. I'm in my third hour of my mind-numbing meeting. I wanted to basically take every pen in the room and shove it into my eyeball. And I remembered the clown. And I started laughing openly in the meeting. Now people were like, "What happened?" So I told them the story. Everybody laughed. We had a very productive half an hour. This man increased our productivity. Why don't we just pay artists? So I don't agree with guaranteed national income. I agree artists should just get a salary. Go out there and make us feel crazy. Go paint the walls, because you don't need to give them an incentive. You see, that's why incentivization is a ridiculous idea with people who are artists. If you're artistic, you're going to do it anyway. You're going to wake up at 5 in the morning, put on a clown suit and stand there. Nobody paid this person. So you don't need to incentivize everything. Artists can get some money to survive and then be mad. And the rest of us enjoy guaranteed social wages. And then we find some way to earn some income. There's a way in which we can create interesting economies.
Yeah, that's really great. And it points to some of the interesting contradictions in the universal basic income movement. So one of the striking things is that all these tech companies now, all these tech millionaires support universal basic income. And there's all these NGOs that have been involved in UBI experiments in Kenya and elsewhere. So all of this is happening without the need for redistribution, basically. And it seems like, in some ways, a deferral of the class antagonism, right? So if we give people something, we don't have to worry about it. But it brings me to a kind of moving outside of the United States a little bit and thinking about the global South. One of the striking things about neoliberalism in the context of the global South is, unlike the global North, there's actually been an expansion of state provisions, right? Not quite welfare projects, but cash transfer programs, other kinds of provisions. And so how do we think about those kinds of projects in the global South as either different kinds of responses, different versions of neoliberalism?
By the way, before we get to the global South, in this French election, boy, that's a real sign that the world is in a sewer. I mean, the choice is between a lunatic right-wing thug and this guy who wants to fire all public employees. And somehow he was the progressive. I mean, it's a stunning place we have got ourselves into. When I said this to somebody, she said, imagine that. At least in France, they have 120,000 public employees to fire. I mean, in the United States, where will you find them? In Chicago, how many public employees are left? I don't know. I was at the Navy Pier. I saw the strikers there from the Teamsters. And I took the flyer, and the flyer was talking about 43 workers who were being, 43 workers unionized. The rest of them ununionized there. Amazing. So, yeah, Global South, in terms of the schemes, I mean, let's just imagine India for a second. Half the population of India, which is twice the US population, 770 million people. That's about twice the US population. Half the Indian population lives in deprivation. That means they don't know where the next meal is coming from. I mean, that's half of India's population. Twice the US population. It's just off the radar even in Indian policy making. So even in India, when they came up with cash transfer schemes in rural areas, they were honestly abysmally produced. I mean, what you need in rural India right now is you need a massive scheme just to feed people. There are 4 man-made famines, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Sudan, and one more. 4 that the UN has called critical threshold level famines. The UN asked for some $400 million to cover food delivery in these famine areas. And they were able to raise some 10, 12 million. I'm just coming to that because when we think of cash transfer schemes, etc., we live in a desperately hungry planet where people are surviving on marginal amounts of nutrition a day. And the schemes to ameliorate that are so absolutely anemic. The US budget is a great example of the values of the country. Whatever people, however nice people are, $700 billion to the military, $29 billion to the State Department. So $700 billion to the military, $29 billion for diplomacy. Who cares about the State Department? It's not an equal player with the Pentagon. Please don't imagine, just because these are 2 cabinet secretaries, that they're equivalent. One is running a budget of $700 billion, the other $29 billion. Overseas aid is embarrassingly low and even getting sliced further. So the situation of peril in the rest of the world is so great. My feeling is when I talk about ISIS and the military, I'm amazed that more mutinies haven't broken out around the planet Earth. I'm amazed when we say in Mexico it's perilous, another journalist was killed yesterday, horrible, the drug killings. I'm amazed that there's not more of this. This city is a great example of fear. 1871, there was a massive fire, the Chicago fire. 1872, a relief society was created. It was barely taking care of the workers. So the workers then marched on the relief society. They were bludgeoned, some of them to death, up near, Water Street. Now, what is it? How do you say it? Wacker Drive? Then in 1877, during the general strike around the United States, there was a big demonstration, again up in that loop area, at City Hall, and there was the so-called Battle of the Viaduct. Hundreds of workers got their bones broken because this city's elite feared the Paris Commune. The history of the Paris Commune was very alive, 1871, summer of 1871. They beat the workers into submission here. Imagine around the world, I'm amazed that more people don't rise up. In that sense, why I don't believe in the imminent arrival of fascism is that why do you need fascism when ideology is doing your work for you? Why is it that people all around the world believe they can become entrepreneurs? The ideology of entrepreneurialism has succeeded. It has saturated the global consciousness. So last year, I went to a rural area in India, and I was talking to farmers in a wretched area. People had cell phones. They said, the government told us we have downloaded this app. It's going to improve our understanding of prices. It might improve the understanding of prices, that's true, but they're starving. Input prices are up. Fertilizer price, all these prices are up, and price supports have disappeared in the market. So this is the situation we are in. So when we think of the rest of the planet, if I were rich, I would build a bigger moat. I would order more crocodiles to swim in it. I would order more pikemen to stand and defend my terrain, my little keep, from the revolt of the masses. Because if the rich in America think that these Trump voters are the masses coming and screaming at them, they haven't seen anything yet.
Okay, on that note, we will open it up for Q&A from the audience. So if you could just come and use this microphone so we can hear your question, please.
Don't need the mic. How does monetary system fit into all of this? And what kind of monetary system could actually be put in place for a new economy or this kind of alternate world that you're alternative that you speak of?
There was a phrase that was used in the 1970s, that there's the Cold War, but then there's the Gold War. And this was referring to America leaving the gold standard in 1971 and then coming to a position of so-called floating of currencies, where basically the currencies float around the dollar, and the dollar anchors the system and is the global currency, etc. You know, the solution isn't in a new monetary system. The solution is allowing regions to capture the planning of the region. And I'll give one example. Before the commodity prices in the world collapsed, the most positive regional project was the project in South and Central America and the Caribbean. That was the ALBA project, the alternative Bolivarian model. And what they had done is they had devised their own currency called the sucre, which was going to be for cross-border, basically to settle accounts when goods cross borders, so they don't have to go through the dollar. But what was interesting about that wasn't the monetary aspect. It was that they were creating regional markets. You know, when you look at statistics on globalization, for most of human activity, the activity is not globalized. You know, most of the things people buy and trade are very local and regional. So the issue is to strengthen regional economies. You know, the cruel nationalists speak in a language of nationalism. We're going to maintain sovereignty over our borders, etc. But that's a ruse. That's not really, you cannot maintain sovereignty over your borders. But we can create regions where there is a much more open understanding, you know, of trade relations, of kind of mutual understanding of goods being transferred, and of populations moving. But the barrier to understanding regions are the old devils, like racism. In the North American context, you can't have open borders because of racism regarding the Mexicans. You might open the border to the north. That's a different matter. But the Mexican problem is enduring. In Europe, the British essentially had Brexit because of the Eastern Europeans. You know, don't misunderstand how racism works. You know, racism isn't about skin color. It's a very complicated phenomena. And the Slavic people were often seen as a much inferior people coming to England, wearing sweatpants. I mean, the caricatures of Poles in England is entirely the grammar of racism. You know, the men were characterized as gangsters with sweatpants, sweatsuits with gold chains. You know, there was, so what I'm saying is that the regional question must be in our thinking, that the response to globalization and labor arbitrage, which advantages capital against labor, the solution to that isn't back to the nation. The solution has to be regional. You know, we have to think in a more robust way, because we cannot allow ourselves to return to the fantasies of old-fashioned German romantic nationalism. That we are gone beyond. I mean, India as an example, India is already not a nation. The current government wants it to become more homogeneous and a nation. But it's essentially like a United States of India. You know, it's a highly diverse zone with people. So we have to think regionally in the way we organize our economies, our solidarity economies. You know, I mean, look at the way India behaves with Nepal. Treats it essentially as a place where you can keep closing the borders, screwing them, you know, putting the screw. You can't behave like that to your neighbor. You know, we have to rethink the way regions function, and the Bolivarians were beginning to teach us that until commodity prices collapsed, and now God knows what will happen.
Hi. I guess I have just a few comments and a question. I heard you on the radio on NPR this morning and was so impressed with the thinking. And I love the way you got me thinking, you know, framing issues. I think you said you had two big questions you're pursuing. So I'd like maybe if you could remind me of those two guiding questions. But also, I guess just what I see as I listen to you, I wish you're expounding on kind of Marxist, socialist thought, and it's so refreshing because we don't hear it anywhere here. I love the fact that you call, Nazi and fascist and racist, and because I see the ideology. My stepfather actually raised me on Ayn Rand and neoliberal thought, and I now am kind of deconstructing that, but you can't get enough of it. Hearing people like you, I go to the International Socialist Organization. I need to go more. But to hear it in economics, how does it apply? Because I don't know how to do a revolution,
That's a great line. Nobody does, but that's a great line.
Right. There's no jobs in socialism. That's another one. But, it's one point. I like the way there's this cruelty and there's some. I listen to the radio and try to think, can I get this idea out? But I just wanted to say it here. When you talk, I've read that the contract with America put the National Security Revitalization Act required that UN peacekeeping be tied to NATO war making. And nobody talks about that. That contract with America put through very neoliberal fascist ideas that were all implemented and not dismantled because nobody even knows they're there. They also, so it's so important when you talked about, the statistics of war versus peace. It's this systemic little thing that's buried in there that needs to be, we fix the justice system, but the laws, there's also honest services laws got pushed to the state. And something like a Citizen Protection Act that Lyndon LaRouche came up with, or a lot of people were asking for, that said prosecutors have to go by federal ethics laws other than taking bribes. And it just got buried. It was different forms in the House and the Senate. So I agree, it's Nazism, and there's actual evidence of Leo Strauss, who was here, and Carl Schmitt, who, laws and economics. We've got a real problem, and it's almost like forensic history. You have to go back in history and try to remember what they were doing in the 1870s. So thank you. I want to hear what you have to say.
I mean, by the way, the reason I said that's a great line, I don't know how to make a revolution, is, that's true. I think everybody feels that. I think we are at the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and if you read Lenin's writings from 1917, he was making it up as he went along. I mean, his April theses were written largely as an exile. And then he shows up and he sees that the Soviets are robust, and then he said, all power to the Soviets, and then he saw that the others were taking power in the Soviets. He said, well, no more all power to the Soviets. Revolutions are conjunctural. And when we look at, say, the Arab Spring, it's a very instructive moment that you can't claim to take power unless you're strong enough. If you are weak, you should not stake power, because the crushing defeat is too much for people to bear. The left has to be very judicious. I mean, the American left is in such miserable state. To imagine at any point now that you can make a claim to power is ridiculous. We have to build our strength, build confidence among people, which means to arm people with understanding. That, I think, is a very crucial part of confidence. You have to try to understand what's happening in the system, how it's operating, etc. The media is a brilliant manipulator of public consciousness. I mean, I occasionally watch a couple of the cable shows, and it's amazing how euphemistic they are about everything. Just to take my countryman as an example, Fareed Zakaria. Fareed Zakaria, after the financial crisis, wrote a book boosting the same policies. Here's a serial plagiarist who has a platform on mainstream TV, just plugging the same policies without any shame. without actually having his editor, Adom, when your editor says to you, listen, in chapter X, you've got all this stuff on, how the global economy should function. You should maybe address the financial crisis at some point, answer for yourself. No, you don't. You just pretend it didn't happen. And in fact, that's exactly how the entire political class behaved. We'll pretend it didn't happen. Jamie Dimon, you can go in front of a Senate committee and you can say, we're going to make a great economy again, and everybody claps. And they say, you people are heroes. You CEOs are heroes because you're also philanthropists. And therefore, you are the ones that, we judge to be the people who we put on Time magazine cover, etc. So this obfuscation or euphemism, or maybe even just plain lying from people like Fareed, very smart guy, writes very well, doesn't make spelling mistakes, unlike the president, but yet is, I think, very deceitful in the views put forward, or at least marginally dishonest. If you are wrong, you should account for why you are wrong. You should call account to your own audience and say, I was wrong on this. This is why. This is what I've learned from it. I would be much more interested. This is why perhaps Christian penitence is more impressive to me than neoliberal arrogance. Get on your knees and beg forgiveness of God. They've never had to beg forgiveness for anything. And this financial crisis wasn't the only one. 1873 crisis. Who, came and said, I'm sorry for what I did to create the collapse of value in 1873 that led to the 1877 railroad strike. Where were the penitents then? The masters of the universe have never to be called to account. Let's switch gears to war. Today, one of the things I was talking about is how can you understand West Asia without the illegal American war in Iraq? How is it possible? How can Tony Blair be selected as the envoy of the West for the Israel-Palestine? How is it possible? How incredible, how stupid are we as a people that we accept that now George W. Bush is on Ellen selling a book of his portraits of American war wounded? This is a war criminal. At what point does a country be called into account for an illegal war? Never. Therefore, you can go and destroy Libya. Nobody called you to account for Iraq, then destroy Libya. Then destroy the next one, then the next one. What difference does it make? Nobody's going to send you to the dock. The only people to go to the dock are Africans and Eastern Europeans. That's the world we live in. So calling to account, I think, should be the first order of moral business. The point of being alive and being a human being is not to want to be lied to. I was very impressed with the group, what is it called? Not Indignant, but whatever it is, who organized the town hall. Indivisible. Sorry, Indignant would have been better. Indivisible. Where people went in there and said, you're a liar. Called people to account. The first thing is you want them to answer for their crimes.
First of all, I really, really appreciate your analysis. And I think that revolutions are made when people like you work with people like me. I'm in labor. And what I find is a lot of people in labor are still working within a 20th century analysis of capital. And it's refreshing to see that you brought it up to the 21st century. So I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about, the financialization of capital, which way that's going, how it's taking the lead and where the world is going. Could you go into that a little bit more?
So finance is a very interesting industry. I took interest in it when I was doing a book on the Global South in the neoliberal period. And what was so fascinating was reading the documents in the 70s and 80s of the G7 meetings, the Group of Seven discussions, reading a lot of IMF staff reports and the governor's meeting, public statements, etc., I just kept thinking, wow, Karl Marx, man, you sitting without much means in the British Museum reading blue books, etc., how did you get the dynamics so clearly? Like, he picked up certain things, and they are actually quite crystal clear and sharp. One of them being, capital is like mercury, like quicksilver. It doesn't want to rest anywhere. I mean, from the emergence of capital, there's been a tendency to move towards being as mobile as possible. The worst thing about old mercantile capital, traders' capital, was that you'd have to finance a ship. And it used to take ages to go to Malaysia, to wherever, Batavia. And they'd trade cloves or whatever, and then it would take ages to come back, and it might sink. So capital was trapped for the time of the journey. So the move then comes to industrial capital, where things are much quicker. But still they take time. You have to invest in a piece of land, build a factory, hire laborers, get raw materials. You only get a return on your investment when you start selling. So industrial capital, the speed of the rate of return much faster than mercantilism. Mercantile capital, not mercantilism. Then you come to finance, the early forms of finance even usury. You lend somebody money, you can start making money quite quickly on the loan. It has to be paid in 3 months, 4 months, much faster than industry. Look at it today. Today you go and buy a house, you take a mortgage from a bank. The bank has already sold your mortgage before you left the door. You're out there at the door picking up some sweet from that bowl which you should never touch because people urinate and don't wash their hands, put their hands in there, but you nonetheless take some sweets from there while you're out there gathering somebody's urine specks. They've already sold your mortgage. Because they don't wait. Capital no longer wants to wait around, which is why vast amounts of petrodollars, petroleum profits from the 1970s, which were deposited in the Western banks, created this enormous reservoir of unmade value in Western banks. That was the essence of the financial boom. This enormous petrodollar money, this huge volume of money that entered Western banks. Now you're sitting with this money, nobody wants to invest it and wait 8 months, 9 months, 3 years for a return. What's the best thing to do? Money invests in money. You create the financial services industry, derivatives, this, that. You can make money on currency. I mean, it is inconceivable that you should be allowed to bet on currency. George Soros, another great philanthropist, bankrupted the Russian ruble. Teachers in Russia couldn't get salaries because Soros made, what was it, $1 billion some in a day, and then opened the Open Society to help, the world. You've bankrupted. Why did you not, instead of bankrupting the teachers in Russia, let them teach and have a salary, and, you go and get an honest job. Instead, you bankrupted them because you had volume. Franklin Templeton, 9/11 happened. Mr. Templeton was still alive then, waited for the market to open, had his people, many of them from one of the very biggest banks in New York, watched the market. He said, buy 2 stocks within the end of the first and second hour, by Boeing and by United. Moment the market opened, because people are silly, Boeing and United stocks collapsed. Templeton bought and he sold it at the end of the day. Because everybody knows Boeing is a good investment. It's going to keep building planes. Templeton made billions of dollars. He was a 9/11 speculator. Made billions of dollars on that one trade. So the thing with capital, the financialization piece of it, is that now it has reached the point where instead of having, so they have defeated time. Capital has vanquished time. You can now make fortunes in seconds. You can play through a computer against currency movement and make money in seconds. So why do you need to invest in things? Obama opened the discount window at the Federal Reserve, told banks, come and take money. They were giving them at negative interest rates. Banks took hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, lent it to big other secondary banks, tertiary banks. They didn't invest a thing. They're just sitting on the money. It's what I consider the constipation of the financial system. They're making money on money, but not investing in the world. That's the end point of finance. It's actually not a productive, what I'm trying to say is it's not a productive part of the human experience.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, but there's two folks, so maybe you guys can both ask your question, and then we'll give Vijay the last word.
Well, I'm asking a question is really advice. Framing it within the rise of intersectionality and if the U.S. Census was correct with the demographic shift that is due to occur within the United States, why is the left so white? I mean, why are they not taking advantage of all of these people that you would think would be allies in trying to, create a new space? I can keep asking the same question in different ways, but that's the gist of it.
Got it. Good question. Take both of them. Yeah.
Professor, thank you so much for coming. You had spoken about cruel populism, and I was wondering, is there a different form of populism that is valuable or necessary? And if so, what place does populism serve in our society? And if there was an idea that you could think of, like, what if we could do this? This is just maybe one thing. What would you say? And thank you so much.
Yeah, great question. See, let's go with your question. Firstly, it depends what you mean by the left. I mean, if you mean the sectarian left, the small groups that exist, that are battling each other for the correct line, then yes, they are very much white, but not, of course, not only white. But the sectarian left, but they don't define the left. I mean, what defines the left is movements that understand themselves to be in direct conflict with the civilization that's dominant, against the dominant civilization. And that, organized in the United States, is dominated by non-whites. They are the dominant force in the left. That is to say, people who understand questions of deportation to be an abomination. People who understand that you can't put 2 million people in prison to be an abomination. People who believe that you can't just stop somebody and shoot them on the street. That is the broad American left. Now, one of the problems is that there may not be an overarching theory that puts the left together. In other words, intersectionality is actually a description of reality. It's not a theory of the future. Intersectionality describes the politics that we actually are in the middle of. People are already active, mobile. People are not submissive. They are on the way. But it's not a theory of the future. If you look at Tony Kushner's very wonderful play, Perestroika, I don't know if it's Angels in America, but the Perestroika section. It opens in the Supreme Soviet in 1991, where Comrade Antediluvievich, who is an old comrade with his eyes pierced out, he's standing on stage, and I love this sequence because I was here in the high point of post-structuralism, which really played with my brain as a grad student. But Comrade Antediluvievich is standing there, and he says to the Supreme Soviet, he says, "What is your theory?" He says, "When we were young, our theory allowed us to climb to the mountain and look at the horizon. We had something that motivated us, that made us believe in something." He says, "You don't have a theory." What is theory? Money, driving to the mall, that's not a theory. That's not a theory of life. And then a classic line, he says, when a snake sheds its skin, it first has to grow another one. Have you another skin, my little snakes? That's his speech he gives at the Supreme Soviet. Have you, my little snakes, a new skin? What we need is an overarching theory. But I don't mean that as, one theory that explains everything, but a theory of the struggle. It's all very well to talk about the resistance, but what is the theory? Is the theory back the Democratic Party in 2018? Is the theory back the Democratic Party in 2022? What's the theory? There seems to be the theory that's in motion. Or is the theory build popular power where you live and don't allow the political process to silence people's dreams? If that's the theory, we have to build it to something much more elaborate. We have to make cathedrals of our ideas. Right now, we are making tiny little temporary shacks. Temporary shacks don't inspire people to go on the street and take the beatings from the state. You have to believe in something. You have to believe in a future. One of the great tragedies of our last 35 odd years is that the concept of the future has disappeared. We have a concept of tomorrow. We all know there'll be a tomorrow. We'll go to sleep, tomorrow will come. But we don't have a concept of the future. We believe in a sense that there's kind of an endless present. What we have today continues endlessly. You make some small adjustments. You tell a police officer, please don't shoot. At least ask a few questions, or, don't shoot into a car that's driving away. We don't mind you. Just don't behave quite like that. Okay, be a little more polite in your brutality. So in that sense, we've lost control of the future. Can you not imagine a world where the police is not an occupying force? Can you imagine a world where security concerns are taken care of by a community? Can you imagine a world where, for instance, you have an economy that is constructed in such a way that people's needs are taken care of? Can we imagine a world where people don't have to have 6 houses when 6 people have no houses? Can we imagine those worlds? Can we imagine a world, just to give you a concrete suggestion, where every president doesn't build a presidential library? Where instead of every president doesn't get a holiday anymore. Now we have generic President's Day. Why not in DC build a president's library? Everybody gets a room. Why should all this real estate be given to presidents' libraries? Why not build an edifice and have it as new homes for the poor? Why not that? Why can't we imagine that? Why is it that all this stuff sounds idealistic? To me, this is all reality. What's idealistic is the entrepreneurial discourse. That's completely crazy. Everybody knows that's not going to work. So if that's not going to work and you have people starving, why not have kitchens where people can come and eat? What a great place for a community, to build respect for itself, rather than have to avoid the eyes of somebody starving on the street, pretend they're not asking you for money, step away, make that necessary detour. Why not produce places where they can live with dignity so you don't have to feel embarrassed? That's, to me, a pressing question. So, you asked, what is the one thing we can do? The one thing we can do is we know that in our society, whatever kind of society, capitalistic, socialistic, whatever, there will be a percentage of the population, that needs to be loved differently. They have some mental issues, they have other issues. Why not just say our social wages must go towards tending to their needs? Why assume everybody is an individual and equal? So that's the kind of society we need to imagine. And I think, again, I just want to emphasize, it's the opposite of idealism. It's actually reality. That every time you ignore somebody who's poor on the street, you're acknowledging their presence. And it's making you feel small to acknowledge their presence. You have some theory, I don't want to give money because, I don't know. I saw a guy on Michigan Avenue with a sign, need money for weed. Straightforward. I gave him $1. Said, enjoy, smoke one for me. Why do we have this feeling when we see people who are in need? And there are millions of people like that. Why do we say, okay, it's better for them to build crystal meth labs in their farms, than build dignified lives of another kind? It's the assumption we have. We know that it's wrong to behave like that, but we don't want to do anything to take care of the problem. We ignore it. So those are practical issues. They are not idealistic. So So that's one. But I'll give you a very, very practical idea, which is tantamount to the clown idea. I'd like to just ask you, in your thinking, you are a young person, you're thinking ahead in your life. Why is it that you're thinking in terms of your career? Why do you spend more time worrying about your career than about your life? I mean, in a funny way, we live our lives daily. The future concept is for history and for civilization. But as individuals, we live our lives daily. We wake up in the morning, then we wake up the next morning, we wake up the next morning. Why don't we spend more time thinking about what kind of people we would like to be than what kind of career we want to have? A career is such a narrowing of what it is to be a human. But they'll have at our colleges big career development spaces where they train you to get careers, because they are also worried about raising money and things like that. They want you to get big jobs, you'll donate more. They have a vested interest in careerizing you. But I don't care about your career. I care about what kind of person you will be. And what kind of person you will be is linked to what kind of community you live in. Because you cannot be a good person if your community is corrosive. Because you cannot be a good person if you have to walk around a poor person and pretend they don't exist. It's an awkward thing that is sticking because when you don't know